The reign of the last Khan of Khans began with a war between two princes, brothers. The youngest was called Kublai. After the death of Kublai Khan, he claimed the throne in the name of those Mongols who still lived on the steppe and followed the old and traditional way of life. His brother Kublai was more sophisticated. He had adopted a great many customs from Chinese civilization and wished to lead the empire down a different path. The civil war that erupted between these two brothers in 1260 was the first time Mongol had fought Mongol since the tribal wars of Genghis Khan. It threatened to shatter the entire empire. But the two brothers were not evenly matched, and the war did not last long. Although Kublai had the support of all the great Mongol families, he didn't have his brother's strategic genius. Long before any real harm could be done, Kublai's armies were defeated, and the young Kublai emerged victorious. Nothing in the formal court portrait of Kublai, as an older man, indicates how different he was from the other Mongol Khans. He grew up here, on the land he inherited in northern China. Although he learned to ride and hunt like any other Mongol prince, he was also taught to read and write. He grew up in a land of farmers and learned from Chinese teachers to respect and care for those who worked the land. By the time he was 30, he ruled a vast and quite wealthy principality. Kublai's attachment to his Chinese subjects earned him many enemies back in Mongolia, but nothing angered them more than his decision to build a city on Chinese territory. This is almost all that is left of that city, Xanadu. It was built on the frontier between the steppe and the cultivated fields of northern China. Behind its walls, Kublai built a hunting reserve and had it stocked with animals. He dug rivers and filled lakes and planted grass from the Mongol steppe. We know this place as Xanadu.
In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to the sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests, ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery.
These are the foundations of the Pavilion of Great Harmony, which once stood at the heart of the palace city. The roof tiles were once bright green, the grounds decorated with altars and carved statues. Surrounding it were a number of smaller palaces and government buildings. Inside, the pavilions had gold leaf ceilings and walls of painted silk. The man who built this stately pleasure dome was not only extremely wealthy, he was also extremely cultured and had great vision. It was the home of the man who was about to inherit the mantle of Genghis Khan. By 1264, with his enemies cowed into submission, Kublai was accepted as the next great Khan. And so began the reign of Kublai. It was to be an illustrious one. But first he had to piece together an empire fractured by civil war. It would take a man of immense resources to restore unity. Kublai inherited an empire already divided into separate khanates, ruled by various descendants of Genghis. In the far west was the Golden Horde, conquered under Kublai Khan. To the south was the Ilkhanate, ruled by the conquerors of Persia. In the center was the Chagatai Khanate. And the rest of the empire, the Mongol homeland and China, was the personal domain of the great Khan. At that time, it was the largest empire in history, but there was still room for expansion. To the southeast lay the unconquered lands of the Sung, still the real heart of China, and a challenge to Kublai. Kublai's campaign against the Sung began with the conquest of the tiny kingdom of Dali, which lay on the borders of Tibet and guarded the western approaches to Sung China. This remote kingdom was conquered in swift and bloodless fashion, so much so that Kublai was moved to grant the people of Dali rare privileges in return for their submission. Before he moved on, he erected a pillar engraved with his instructions, "No plundering allowed in the little kingdom." It then described in detail Kublai's prowess as a general. Though led by Mongol officers, the bulk of Kublai's forces were made up of Chinese infantry. Southern China was either covered in forest or paddy fields, both terrible terrain for cavalry. So when Kublai's army set forth for Sung China, they traveled on foot. These new armies had different needs. No longer could they hunt for their rations. Supply lines would have to be established. New strategies were also needed. The days of lightning raids and cavalry battles were gone. This war, with Chinese against Chinese, would take years to unfold. The Sung had a great many fortified cities, and when Kublai's forces tried to take Xiangyang, they were held at bay for 5 years. The Sung were ferocious defenders. They had a considerable culture to defend. The Sung also had a great navy and would never really be conquered unless defeated at sea. So again, the Mongols had to adopt a new form of warfare. With Korean and Chinese ships, they pursued the Sung navy until finally destroying it in 1276. When the last male heir to the Sung dynasty was drowned, resistance collapsed. When the Mongol forces finally entered the Sung capital of Hangzhou, at the mouth of the Yangtze River, they confronted the largest city on earth. More than 1.5 million people lived in this great seaport. Its wealth and importance to the empire was unimaginable. From here, a massive civil service governed a nation of nearly 40 million people. Built around a network of canals and waterways, Hangzhou was the pearl of southern China. Along its causeways, the victorious Mongols rode into what was then the most important city in all the Orient. The Mongol commanders catalogued its palaces, granaries, treasure houses, and temples. They also took a census, and instead of destroying everything in the wake of their victory, these Mongols broke tradition by letting the city's treasures and temples stand. The Sung royal family were also allowed to live in relative comfort for the rest of their lives. The war campaign and its aftermath were all part of a much larger strategy, not just to conquer, but to win both the hearts and minds of the Chinese. This policy was encouraged by Kublai's senior wife, Chabi. She urged her husband to legitimize Mongol rule by proclaiming himself emperor, the founder of a new Chinese dynasty. It was extremely shrewd. By drawing on the principles of government laid down by Confucius, Kublai presented himself to the Chinese nation as the very embodiment of Chinese thinking. His enthronement followed the strict accords of traditional Confucian custom. One might say it showed good public relations. It prompted the revival of dozens of traditional ceremonies that had not been performed at court for many years. In choosing the name Yuan for his dynasty, Kublai also turned to Confucian principles. The word Yuan has powerful connotations. In the book, the I Ching, it means the origins of the universe. Kublai united all of China, from the foothills of Burma to Manchuria, under a single dynasty, a single lord. By proclaiming the Yuan dynasty, Kublai gave every impression of having forsaken Mongol life. But that was not quite the case. Behind a screen of Confucian ceremonies, Kublai established an order of racial precedence. The most important positions were held by Mongols, and the most lowly by the southern Chinese. Kublai designed a centralized Mongol authority of 3 divisions. First, a secretariat responsible for all civil matters. Second, a privy council responsible for all military matters. And third, a censorate, a vast army of spies that traveled the country to squash rebellions. From the east now continues. By nationalizing all the gold and silver mines throughout China, like this one that dates from his time, Kublai set out to establish a government-controlled economy centered around a large central treasury. The mining or hoarding of all precious metals was forbidden. There would be a state monopoly. From across the country, precious ores, even silver coins, were transported under guard to the new state-operated mints. Here, the ores were melted down and turned into imperial ingots. Soon, a vast reserve of silver existed in a variety of weights, each stamped with the official imperial mark. Kublai had effectively created a silver standard. Against these reserves, Kublai had printed paper notes, which were distributed throughout the land, in return for coins or silver. So in a nation of over 50 million people, there was one official currency, and it was Kublai's. His was probably the first administration in the world to have what amounted to a central bank and a semi-planned economy. Kublai knew that the key to a strong economy, then as now, was production and trade. Chinese ceramics were greatly valued abroad, so he encouraged the establishment of potteries all across the south near the great seaports. Kublai, the grandson of a nomadic horseman, issued licenses to every factory. He did everything he could to encourage production. Soon the countryside was shrouded in smoke from hundreds of kilns that worked day and night to keep up supply. While artisans produced pottery, silks, silverware, carpets, furniture, and armaments, Kublai built a massive merchant fleet to carry them around the Eastern world. He was the great Khan of half the world and would take every advantage of it. His fleets, captained by skilled navigators, traded across Southeast Asia to India and even as far west as the Persian Gulf. Here, in particular, in the cities of the Ilkhanate, Chinese pottery was in high demand. But a trade of ideas and technology gave this sea link its importance. Here in the Gulf, Chinese merchants made a valuable discovery. The Persian artisans had developed a number of new ceramic dyes. The most famous was cobalt. After it had been ground into a thin paste, the Persians used it to coat mud bricks before they were fired. In the kiln, this dull gray finish was transformed into a radiant blue. The local builders used these thick tiles to clad the outside of their domed buildings. In China, the cobalt imported from the Persian Gulf was used to produce the most intricate patterns. Under Kublai, Chinese potters had some freedom to improvise. They could illustrate any subject, as long as it was about hunting and horses. During this period, the first blue-white glazes were produced, the very best of Chinese pottery. It was a two-way trade. Chinese techniques soon influenced Persian artists. Buildings were decorated in ever more complex ceramics, and their designs reflected the Oriental influence. Though he never knew it, Kublai could take much of the credit. Kublai understood that trade across the breadth of Asia could help solidify his empire. He poured fortunes into any number of projects to encourage trade. He expanded the great harbor here at Hangzhou, and each year thousands of ships were guided through the straits by a lighthouse near the mouth of the inner harbor. The old Sung capital became the most important trading center in the world. Kublai swept away traditional Chinese isolationism and, against the wishes of his Chinese advisors, encouraged foreigners to visit the new China. Persian merchants from the Ilkhanate arrived, built trading houses, villas, and of course mosques. Islam spread along the coastal cities, side by side with Hinduism, brought by merchants and craftsmen from the subcontinent. Arabs from the Gulf, Turks from Asia Minor, Russians from the Golden Horde. For the first time in their history, China was filled with foreign cultures. The Mongol policy of religious tolerance under Kublai saw the spread of alien religions. And when the Pope agreed to establish an archbishopric in China, Kublai hailed it as evidence that his empire really was universal, and China was at its center. But it was Kublai's links with the great Italian city-states, particularly Venice, that demonstrated his true internationalism. The Venetians had traded in Oriental cargoes for years, but only through Persian middlemen. Now there were encouraging reports of a safe overland route along the Great Khan's highways leading directly to Cathay, and Venetian merchants hoped to get there first. In 1271, Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco Polo set off from a house which once stood here. Their destination, the land of the Great Khan. When they departed, the Venetians thought they might be away for 2 or 3 years. In fact, they were away for 17, and Marco Polo's book about his travels and adventures was closely studied by traders and medieval geographers. He described in detail his journey from Venice, across Asia to the Kublai's fabled city of Xanadu. There they were granted an audience with the Great Khan, and he delivered the letters of greeting from the Pope. The Mongol hordes stormed from the east will continues. The Polos were followed by other European merchants. To aid their journeys, Kublai built along the route 1,000 new port stations, or caravansaries. Each was provided with a hostelry, a granary, stables, and fresh pack animals. It was the start of a remarkable era in the history of trade. All along the Great Khan's highways, thousands of merchants traveled back and forth. For the first time, East traded with West, face to face. But the 1,000 caravanserais which Kublai built were nothing compared to the great engineering projects he was initiating in China, like the Great Canal. More than 3 million laborers worked more than 10 years to complete the canal. The Great Canal was built to alleviate the persistent famines in northern China caused by a shortage of arable land. But a canal that linked Hangzhou in the south with the great cities of the north would ensure imported supplies. It was a remarkable feat of engineering for any age in history. The canal was more than 150 miles long, with hundreds of locks, some of which still exist today. The canal was also cut deep enough to accept ocean-faring junks, and so ships that sailed the islands of Southeast Asia could navigate their way more than 100 miles inland. The canal ended at a large inland port, another part of Kublai's great enterprise. At the end of the canal was a city, bigger and more magnificent than the legendary Chengdu. This was the new capital of a new united China. Here, the ships could deliver their cargo at the end of their journey right at the Khan's door. 700 years later, there are still echoes from Kublai's day. During the late 1960s, archaeologists discovered sections of the old street and foundations. For a brief period, it was possible to glimpse the remains of pavilions, temples, and statues. The scholars worked quickly to catalog their discoveries before it was all covered up and built over. The only other physical legacy of the old capital were the great walls that once embraced it. Like a great many relics from the past, they were pulled down during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. The last of the great city gates were bulldozed to make way for a freeway. But with the aid of archaeologists' records and modern computer animation, Kublai's greatest success can be recreated. This was Dadu, the great middle capital, Kublai's ultimate gift to his subjects. It was the ideal Chinese city, built upon Confucian ideals. The city sat within a perfect rectangle. The boundary walls ran for 24 miles. Each faced either north, south, east, or west. Inside were two smaller compounds which contained the inner city and the imperial city. The inland harbor swept right up to the trading district. There, rows of warehouses stood along a grid of boulevards, which designated separate districts for artisans, merchants, and foreigners. Parks and gardens dotted the landscape. But the heart of Dadu was the great imperial city. High officials and envoys entered the inner sanctum from the south, the traditional Chinese approach, through one of 12 city gates. From there, they traveled a little more than a mile to the Imperial Way, toward Kublai's palace. This road passed through the middle compound, which housed government departments and the homes of the civil servants. Just beyond the Huzai Gate, they crossed a series of bridges and continued to the gate of the palace city. The gate itself housed more senior ministries, government records, and imperial galleries. Passing through here, the visitors entered the private world of the great Khan. The inner palace city consisted of 3 main halls or pavilions where Kublai conducted court ceremonies and private affairs. But for Kublai and his immediate family, these pavilions were never really home. A large area was reserved to the east and planted with grass from the Mongolian steppes. Here they pitched their traditional gurs. This was Kublai's real home, and where visiting Mongol princes preferred to stay, under felt roofs. Here, traditional shaman ceremonies took place under the disapproving gaze of the Confucians. In the midst of this ideal city, Kublai affirmed his nomadic heritage. But the real image of Dadu was an awe-inspiring walled city whose ceramic-tiled roofs projected immense wealth and imperial power. The source of all imperial power was the area of the 3 main pavilions, the Yud Hall, Gongchen Hall, and the greatest of all, Damingdyun. It was built on a raised structure that placed it at the top of carved marble stairs and balustrades, decorated with dragons and phoenixes. The inside was even more elaborate. According to records, there were golden dragons, red mullion windows, gold leaf everywhere. At the rear, at the end of a long corridor, a private throne room hosted the most important audiences. From these balconies, Kublai would greet his subjects during annual festivals and watch as they kowtowed before the most powerful man on earth. But Dadu was only the beginning of Kublai's ambitions. It had to be populated, and not just by merchants and traders. For Dadu to succeed, it had to attract families from the traditional ruling class. Kublai's solution was to turn Dadu into a city of culture, and he would be the country's greatest patron. Throughout the capital, he built public theaters and sponsored companies to perform in them. Kublai himself greatly enjoyed the theater, and his regular presence elevated its importance within society. Hundreds of companies toured the country with a growing repertoire of new works. Drama became more colloquial, dealing with stories of ordinary people and accessible themes. It was an era of tremendous literary development. The East now continues. One of Kublai's other great passions was painting. He commissioned hundreds of new works and built galleries to house them. This is Kublai himself on the hunt. Kublai's reputation might have gone untarnished, but he could not ignore his Mongol heritage. He yearned for yet further conquest. This would have been the view from the shores of Hakata Bay in Japan on a summer morning in 1281. On such a morning, a massive armada of 150,000 men sprang forth. They had been sent by Kublai to conquer Japan. This was the second such invasion. 6 years earlier, another invasion fleet had been scattered by a great storm. This time, with more men and ships, success should have been assured. But the Mongol commanders soon discovered that the Japanese defenses were much stronger than they expected, and their troops, most of them Chinese, had little enthusiasm for the campaign. The invaders struggled bitterly for months to breach the defenses. Then, just when it seemed Kublai's forces would prevail, another great storm blew up. For the second time, the gods of nature thwarted Kublai's chances. The Mongol fleet prepared to evacuate, but as the soldiers tried to clamber on board, they were cut to pieces. Those who managed to escape probably drowned. Nearly the entire fleet sank. It was the most humiliating defeat in Mongol history. Nearly 80,000 men went to the bottom of Hakata Bay. To this day, the occasional remnants of Kublai's ambitions are washed up on the beaches. To the Japanese, Kublai's disaster carried tremendous significance. The typhoon was no accident. It was a divine wind, kamikaze, sent by the gods to save Japan. This garden near Hakata Bay is filled with shrines dedicated to the defenders and to gods who acted on Japan's behalf. Here is enshrined the belief that the gods would never allow Japan's enemies to conquer and occupy her territory. It helped to forge the Japanese belief in themselves as unique and different from all other peoples, specially protected by gods. The disaster at Hakata Bay was only one of the humiliating military defeats that brought little comfort to Kublai at the end of his life. He spent his final days in an alcoholic haze, shrouded in disappointment and shame. When he died in 1294, the empire had seen the last of the truly great descendants of Genghis Khan. In the foothills of the Chinese northern highlands, where the Mongol army first broke through into China, there is a small stone archway. It was set up by Kublai's successors as a lasting tribute to Mongol control of China. On its walls, alongside Buddhist figures, are accounts in 3 languages of the Mongol conquest and the lives of Yuan emperors. But the real legacy of Mongol domination in China lies here, the forbidden city of modern-day Beijing. It was built by successive dynasties upon the ruins of Kublai's great capital. Its importance to China owes much to the builders of Dadu. Remarkably, it has remained the capital of a united China ever since Kublai decreed it 700 years ago. Within the space of just 3 generations, the Mongols had gone from barbaric destroyers to builders of cities. And the Mongols left another legacy, though one they didn't build: the Great Wall. Erected by the successors to the Yuan, the Ming Dynasty, the Great Wall was a formidable declaration by the Chinese that they would never again allow their country to be occupied and ruled by foreigners. The Great Wall marked the end of China's trade and intellectual links with the outside world. It signaled a return to a traditional, inward-looking way of life. But during the brief period of time when the Mongols ruled Asia, and the people and ideas moved easily between the East and the West, history changed course, and the world would never be the same. For example, the Chinese had for centuries printed their most valuable works from wooden blocks, and so papers and books could be printed in unlimited copies. Movable type followed soon afterwards. By the 15th century, printers in the West were doing the same. Gunpowder also had its genesis in the East. The Mongols first encountered it during their sieges of Chinese cities. 10 years later, Hungarian chroniclers recorded its use by the invading Mongol army of 1241. There were also more prosaic ideas from the East. Noodles. Venetian merchants imported the delicacy to Italy. Spaghetti. Another import from the Mongol Empire would irreversibly change Europe. In 1346, the Black Death was first recorded among Mongols laying siege to the town of Kaffa on the Black Sea. Within 30 years, this unknown Asian disease had spread from the Crimea as far as France and Britain, and even as far north as Scandinavia. It killed 1 in 3 people in Europe. By then, the empire itself was already disintegrating. First to go was the Ilkhanate in Persia, followed 30 years later by China. The last Khanate to hold out was the Golden Horde, which survived in fragments for almost 300 years. Today, the Mongol homeland is simply a remote enclave. It is back where it all began. The harsh realities of modern politics have left it isolated between the 2 worlds of Russia and China. The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, will return. Now continues. Today, Mongols struggle to find a role in the modern world, a world dominated by the city. Over recent years, tens of thousands of them have abandoned the land for an urban lifestyle. Above them are the tower blocks that came with the promises of Soviet communism. Under communist dictatorship, Mongolia was brutally industrialized, and the ramshackle legacy of that recent era is seen almost everywhere around its capital and the only city, Ulaanbaatar. Now that the Russians have gone, the Mongols face a country virtually bankrupt, with Russian-built factories and power stations collapsing around them. There are no engineers, no resources to pay for spare parts. In the winter, the cities freeze, and the power stations belch wasted heat into the sky. For the past 80 or 90 years, the Mongols served as tools for other people's empires. They were swept along toward other people's goals. Now, at the end of the century, they face another chapter in their long history. They are asking themselves, what next? Where from here? For the people who have stayed on the land, little has changed and little will change. Their lives intertwine with the seasons and the needs of their herds. But most Mongolians no longer live this close to the old nomadic life. For the majority, change brings new rituals and customs. In the traditional Nadam festival, a kind of Mongol tournament of archery, wrestling, and horse racing, ancient nomadic skills, present-day Mongols celebrate their once glorious history. The whole festival serves as an instrument to revive nationalism, a distraction from the day-to-day realities. Ancient heroes are brought to life, battles are refought, cities reconquered, and the sayings of the long-dead Khans turned into song. Evocations of the past filter through nearly all aspects of contemporary life, from politics to pop music. Even members of the Mongolian regular army parade before the crowds in the costume of their ancestors. Mongolia, with a shattered present and an uncertain future, is forever looking over its shoulder at what used to be. The nation's ancient history provides the link to a cultural identity. Behind all the pageantry and pomp, Mongolians have a deep devotion for one man. The son of a nomadic chieftain who united the steppe tribes, forged a single nation, and set it on the path to world conquest. Ordinary Mongolians still offer up prayers to the spirit of Genghis Khan. They remember a time when they ruled over the greatest land empire the world has ever seen.
Look back on a royal scandal that shocked England and the world as we present part 2 of A King's Story, next on TLC Presents.